Bette Davis said what everyone was thinking but terrified to speak. Hollywood's most beloved actresses didn't earn their roles. They earned them on their backs. The two-time Oscar winner, a woman who clawed her way to the top through sheer talent and warfare with studio heads, watched younger, prettier women trade sex for stardom while she was building an actual career. And she wasn't quiet about it. Davis didn't just criticize, she named names. 7 actresses, she declared, were nothing but high-priced call girls with studio contracts, betting directors, producers, and moguls to climb the ladder. But here's what made Davis truly dangerous. She might have been right. From the verified casting couch horrors to the documented affairs that launched careers, Davis's accusations cut deeper than jealousy. They exposed Hollywood's dirty secret. The system was rigged, and powerful men wrote the rules. The question isn't whether these women were promiscuous. It's whether calling them out made Bette Davis a truth-teller or a hypocrite sharpening her knives on her competition's reputations. Marilyn Monroe, the blonde ambition. Bette Davis called her a walking casting couch, and it was one of her cruelest assessments, precisely because it contained a sliver of truth wrapped in deliberate misinterpretation. Marilyn Monroe's metamorphosis from Norma Jean Mortensen, an orphaned foster child shuffled between abusive homes, into Hollywood's most bankable star, wasn't magic. It was mechanics. And those mechanics were built on exploitation. Studio documents declassified decades later revealed that producer Darryl F. Zanuck didn't just flirt with Monroe, he explicitly demanded private auditions from her before greenlighting her films. These weren't screen tests. Insiders described them as sexual coercion dressed up in professional language. Zanuck, married and 25 years her senior, treated Monroe like a contractual obligation. Director Elia Kazan, who directed her in A Streetcar Named Desire, later confessed that their affair was transactional, not romantic, a phrase that should have damned him but instead became Hollywood footnote trivia. Monroe herself, in private letters discovered after her death, described feeling like a piece of property being bid on by rich men. She was 20 years old. The physical toll was documented. Monroe suffered multiple miscarriages, allegedly induced by stress and the studio's refusal to grant her pregnancy leave. She was given amphetamines to control her weight, barbiturates to sleep, and liquor to medicate her anxiety, all while being told she was lucky to have access to the best of everything. By 26, she was already taking pills to function. Yet Davis's description of Monroe as someone who slept her way out of obscurity was a deliberate inversion of reality. Monroe didn't sleep her way to success. She was systematically raped by the institutional machinery of Hollywood, while contracts ensured her silence. The genius of the studio system was that it made predation look like opportunity. Monroe died at 36, officially from barbiturate overdose, though the circumstances remained suspicious. Her autopsy revealed she'd been ingesting lethal quantities of medication, prescribed or otherwise. Davis saw tragedy as a cautionary tale about ambition without talent. She missed the actual message. Monroe was a murdered woman, and Hollywood held the knife. Ava Gardner, the hunter and the hunted. Ava didn't need a casting couch. She was the casting couch. Davis allegedly sneered, establishing Gardner as someone who wielded her sexuality with predatory intent. The accusation was incomplete, revealing more about Davis's blind spots than about Gardner's choices. Ava Gardner's story was a masterclass in a woman using the only leverage available to her, and the catastrophic cost of that strategy. Gardner was born in rural North Carolina to a tobacco farmer. Her childhood was genteel poverty. 3 meals a day but no prospects, no education beyond what small-town schools offered, and absolutely no escape route except beauty. When Hollywood discovered her at a secretarial job, she was 18 with a GED and a desperate need to become something other than her circumstances. The studio system saw her as raw material to be shaped, packaged, and exploited for profit. Her marriage to actor Mickey Rooney became Hollywood's first cautionary tale about power imbalances in relationships. Rooney was established, Gardner was not. The union lasted only a year, but the damage was permanent. Rooney was physically abusive and publicly humiliating, bragging to studio colleagues about their sex life, and using the marriage to resurrect his fading career. Gardner learned her first lesson. Men would use her body and call it love. Her affair with aviator and industrialist Howard Hughes was darker still. Hughes didn't just pursue Gardner, he attempted to own her. He paid for her apartment, controlled her schedule, and reportedly demanded she submit to gynecological examinations to prove her fidelity. Gardner later described feeling like a possession he kept locked in a safe. Hughes allegedly gifted her a Rolls-Royce, not out of affection, but as collateral to ensure her silence about their relationship. When Gardner eventually left him, Hughes reportedly hired private detectives to monitor her movements for years. Then came Frank Sinatra. Gardner and Sinatra's affair was the scandal that rocked Hollywood to its core. Sinatra was married to Nancy Barbato, a woman who'd stood by him through his early career struggles. He destroyed that marriage to pursue Gardner, leaving his wife and young children. Gardner didn't seduce Sinatra. Rather, Sinatra pursued her with the single-minded obsession of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Their marriage lasted 5 years and was reportedly volatile, with Sinatra becoming jealous and controlling. Gardner later revealed he'd struck her during arguments. The relationship ended in bitter acrimony, with Sinatra attempting to sabotage her career as revenge. Yet Davis's description of Gardner as a man-eater was both accurate and utterly misleading. Yes, Gardner had affairs. Yes, she married multiple times. But each relationship pattern revealed the same dynamic. Powerful men pursued her, used her, and discarded her. Gardner adapted by becoming strategic. If she was going to be used anyway, she'd extract maximum advantage. This wasn't seduction. It was strategic compliance with a rigged game. "I was born with a need for chaos," Gardner later said in interviews. What she meant was, "I was born into poverty, discovered by predators, and learned to survive by playing their game better than they expected." By her 50s, Gardner was living in exile in Spain, estranged from Hollywood, dealing with chronic health issues exacerbated by decades of stress and substance abuse. She died relatively forgotten, remembered primarily for her beauty and marriages rather than her considerable talent as an actress. Davis, meanwhile, remained a legend. Her Joan Crawford, the rival's shadow. Davis saved her most vicious attacks for Joan Crawford, her closest professional rival. And this was where Davis's accusations became genuinely toxic, because Crawford was simultaneously victim and strategist, survivor and collaborator in her own exploitation. The rivalry between Davis and Crawford wasn't merely professional competition. It was a blood feud that consumed both women's careers and defined their legacies. Crawford's alleged affairs with MGM mogul Louis B. Mayer and actor Clark Gable became Hollywood's most salacious gossip, but the gossip obscured a more sinister reality. Mayer didn't seduce actresses out of desire. He wielded sexual access as a management tool. For the women under contract to MGM, sleeping with Mayer wasn't a romantic option. It was a career accelerant that came with implicit coercion. Refuse, and your roles dried up. Comply, and you got better scripts. Crawford allegedly complied, and her career trajectory afterward showed the quid pro quo explicitly. She went from B-list roles to leading lady status within months of her rumored relationship with Mayer. The Clark Gable affair was even more explosive and more documented. Gable's wife, Rita Langham, allegedly discovered Crawford in her marital bed. The betrayal was humiliating and public. Langham filed for divorce, and Crawford became the woman who destroyed a marriage. But the narrative was incomplete. Gable pursued Crawford. Gable was the married man choosing infidelity. Yet Crawford was branded as a homewrecker, the seductress who'd tempted a good man. This was the system's standard playbook. Women bore the moral weight of men's choices. Crawford, however, wasn't passive in this dynamic. Born Joan Lucille Le Sueur, an orphan who'd been raised by her mother, a dancer, in transient poverty, Crawford learned early that her body was her only commodity. By 15, she was dancing in chorus lines to support her family. By the time Hollywood discovered her, she'd already internalized the lesson. Survival meant strategic deployment of sexuality. Crawford deliberately cultivated relationships with powerful men, not because she was a nymphomaniac, Davis's implied accusation, but because she understood the mechanics of advancement in a system rigged against women. What's often overlooked is that Crawford was actually a talented actress. Her Oscar win for Mildred Pierce wasn't a casting couch trophy. It was recognition of genuine skill. But she'd had to survive a decade of demeaning roles and sexual harassment to reach that point. Davis's characterization of Crawford as pathological was Davis's way of dismissing a woman whose survival strategies mirrored her own, just with different results. Both women used their wills, their intelligence, and their bodies strategically. Both navigated a predatory system. But Crawford got ahead faster, and Davis never forgave her. The rivalry escalated over decades. In 1962, when Crawford and Davis were both competing for the same Oscar, for Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Davis won. The victory mattered less because of the award itself, and more because it vindicated Davis's narrative. She was the superior talent, the better actress, the woman who'd earned her position through sheer force of will. Crawford's career declined afterward, while Davis remained formidable. By the time both women died, Davis had written the historical record. Crawford became a punchline, remembered for her affairs rather than her artistry, for her rivalry with Davis rather than her body of work. Davis had won the final battle by controlling the story. Rita Hayworth, Gilda's prisoner. She danced up the studio ladder, Bette Davis said of Rita Hayworth, a phrase that reveals Davis's fundamental misunderstanding of systematic sexual coercion as something chosen. Hayworth's story was perhaps the most tragic of all, a slow-motion catastrophe that began in childhood and never truly ended. Rita Cancino, Hayworth's birth name, was the daughter of a Spanish dancer and an American showgirl. Her father, Eduardo Cancino Sr., was a controlling patriarch who used his daughter as a professional accessory. By age 12, Rita was performing in her father's act, dancing in revealing costumes, marketed as an exotic attraction. She had no childhood, she had a career as her father's property. When she turned 16, her father essentially sold her contract to studio executive Harry Cohn at Columbia Pictures. The transaction was framed as an opportunity. It was a transfer of ownership. Edward Judson, Hayworth's first husband, was allegedly her manager and pimp simultaneously. Judson reportedly arranged for Hayworth to have sex with Harry Cohn in exchange for better roles. This wasn't an affair. It was sex trafficking dressed up in professional language. Cohn was crude about it, allegedly paying Judson directly. Hayworth received the benefit of improved roles but had no agency in the transaction. She was 19. Her subsequent marriages continued the pattern of exploitation. She married Orson Welles, a theatrical genius who was controlling and emotionally abusive. Their marriage imploded amid allegations that Welles was unfaithful and that he'd used the union to boost his own Hollywood profile. Hayworth was humiliated publicly when the marriage dissolved, blamed for the failure despite Welles's own infidelities. Then came Prince Ali Khan, a Pakistani nobleman known for hosting lavish orgies and maintaining multiple mistresses simultaneously. Khan pursued Hayworth relentlessly, and she married him in 1949. The union was a nightmare. Khan flaunted his affairs, introduced Hayworth to a lifestyle of compulsive drug use. She later revealed she'd been addicted to cocaine during this period, and was involved in numerous violent incidents. Hayworth gave birth to their daughter, Yasmin, but the marriage collapsed amid custody battles and scandal. Through all of this, Hayworth's identity had been fractured. "Every man I've known fell in love with Gilda," she said in an interview, referencing her most famous film role, and woke up with Rita. It's perhaps the most heartbreaking statement in old Hollywood history, a woman describing the permanent divorce between her public persona and her private self. She was a brand, not a person, a fantasy, not a woman, a transaction, not a human being. Davis mocked Hayworth for trading Gilda's gloves for a crown, but that framing inverted reality. Hayworth never chose to be Gilda. Hayworth never chose any of her roles. She was assigned them, packaged for them, and consumed by them. She didn't ascend a ladder. She was climbed over repeatedly by men who extracted value and discarded her. By her 60s, Hayworth was battling Alzheimer's disease, remembered more for her roles than her actual artistry. more for her marriages than her performances. She died in 1987, largely forgotten except as a pin-up icon. Lana Turner, the collateral damage. Lana Turner's 8 marriages and her affair with mobster Johnny Stompanato gave Bette Davis an endless supply of ammunition. When Turner's daughter, Cheryl Crane, stabbed Stompanato to death in 1958 during a domestic dispute, Davis called it the fruit of Lana's rotten tree, a comment so casually vicious it revealed the depths of her contempt. But Davis's assessment was grotesquely incomplete, a failure to see a woman trapped in cycles of abuse as anything other than a cautionary tale. Lana Turner was born Julia Jean Mildred Frances Turner in 1921 to a coal miner's family. Her father was murdered in a robbery when she was 9 years old. Her mother remarried multiple times, introducing a series of stepfathers into the household, some of whom allegedly abused Turner sexually. By the time Hollywood discovered her at age 15, Turner was already a traumatized child seeking escape from a nightmare childhood. The studio system didn't rescue her. It continued the nightmare with institutional efficiency. MGM signed Turner to a contract and immediately began marketing her as a sex object. Studio head Louis B. Mayer controlled every aspect of her image, her roles, and her personal life. Turner was groomed, shaped, and positioned as inventory. By 16, she was performing in revealing costumes in films designed to showcase her body rather than her talent. The studio arranged her early marriages, managed her publicity, and controlled her narrative. She had no autonomy. She had a brand. Her first husband, Niels Topping, was an older, wealthy businessman chosen by the studio to stabilize her image. The marriage was a sham designed for publicity. Her second husband, Lex Barker, was an actor who, according to Turner's later testimony, was verbally and physically abusive. Turner endured 2 years of marriage before escaping, but the trauma of abuse would repeat itself throughout her romantic life. Then came Johnny Stompanato, a known associate of organized crime figures, a man with a history of violence and controlling behavior. Stompanato pursued Turner relentlessly, and she, already broken by years of abuse and manipulation, entered into a relationship with him. He was violent, he was jealous, he beat her. By 1958, Turner was living in a nightmare, trapped in an abusive relationship with a mobster. On April 4, 1958, Stompanato and Turner had a violent argument. Cheryl Crane, Turner's 14-year-old daughter, grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed Stompanato to death. The incident was ruled justifiable homicide. The legal system recognized it as self-defense on behalf of her mother. But the public narrative was different. Turner was blamed. She was a woman whose chaotic love life had culminated in bloodshed. Davis's comment, "The fruit of Lana's rotten tree," represented the broader culture's response. Turner was responsible for the violence she'd suffered, and that had infected her daughter. What Davis didn't acknowledge was that Turner's promiscuity and multiple marriages weren't symptoms of moral corruption. They were symptoms of trauma. A woman who'd been sexually abused as a child, groomed by the studio system, and repeatedly trapped in abusive relationships was being pathologized rather than recognized as a survivor trying to escape a pattern she couldn't break. Turner's 8 marriages weren't evidence of her depravity. They were evidence of her desperate search for safety that she never found. By Turner's final years, she was dealing with chronic health problems, substance abuse issues, and the lasting psychological damage of decades of exploitation and violence. She gave interviews later in life describing how men had ruined her, but the framing was incomplete. The system had ruined her. Hollywood had ruined her. The men who abused her had ruined her. And women like Bette Davis, who weaponized that ruin as evidence of moral failing, had participated in the destruction. Turner spent her final decades relatively forgotten, remembered primarily for the scandal rather than her talent as an actress, or her resilience as a human being who'd survived institutional abuse. Hedy Lamarr, genius overlooked. Hedy opens her legs faster than her scripts, Bette Davis quipped, a particularly vicious dig because it dismissed one of the most intellectually gifted women in Hollywood history as nothing more than a body. The cruelty of the comment lies in its accuracy as a description of how Lamarr was treated by the system, combined with its complete inaccuracy as a description of who Lamarr actually was. Hedy Lamarr was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna, Austria, to a Jewish family of significant wealth and culture. Her father was a prominent banker, her mother was a concert pianist. Lamarr was educated, multilingual, cultured, and intellectually ambitious. She was also, undeniably, beautiful, and that beauty would become both her greatest asset and her greatest burden. Lamarr's early film career in Austria and Czechoslovakia established her as a serious actress, but in 1933, she made the film Ecstasy, directed by Gustav Ucicki. The film contained a brief nude scene, the first female nudity in a major European film. Lamarr wasn't exploited into the scene. She chose it as an artistic decision, but that choice would define and confine her entire career. The film was banned in numerous countries, and Lamarr was branded as scandalous, as unchaste, as available. When Lamarr fled Europe in 1937, her first husband, Fritz Mandl, was an arms dealer involved with the Nazi regime who'd allegedly kept her imprisoned in his castle. She arrived in America with a reputation as a naked woman in a dirty film. Hollywood executives weren't interested in her intellect or her range as an actress. They were interested in her body and her notoriety. She was repackaged as an exotic commodity, the European temptress, the woman who'd done what American actresses wouldn't. Her alleged affair with Howard Hughes allegedly secured her MGM contract. The relationship followed the pattern established elsewhere. Hughes pursued, Lamarr was positioned as having seduced him, and the transaction was framed as romance. In reality, Hughes's interest in Lamarr was possessive and controlling. He attempted to limit her film roles, allegedly to keep her available for him, and their relationship ended when Lamarr asserted independence. But here's where Davis's dismissal becomes particularly cruel. While Lamarr was being marketed as a sex object, she was also conducting serious scientific research. During the 1940s, Lamarr collaborated with composer George Antheil to develop frequency hopping technology, a method of transmitting radio signals that couldn't be jammed or intercepted. The technology was decades ahead of its time. They patented it in 1942 with the intention of using it for military communications during World War II. The military showed no interest. The technology was considered too complex for practical application at the time, and the patent eventually expired without commercial development. The tragedy is that Lamarr's invention would later become foundational to Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and military communication systems, technology that would generate billions of dollars. Lamarr received no royalties, no recognition, and no credit. She remained in the public consciousness, the naked woman from Ecstasy and the pretty starlet who'd slept with Howard Hughes. Davis mocked Lamarr's later attempts at invention and innovation as a whore's hobby, a comment that reveals the depths of misogynistic contempt within the Hollywood hierarchy. A woman who'd contributed revolutionary technology to society, who'd demonstrated intellectual capacity equal to or exceeding that of male scientists and inventors, was reduced to her sexual history. Her genius was dismissed as a hobby. Her accomplishments were erased. Lamarr's later life was a tragedy of invisibility. She lived for decades without recognition, struggling with financial difficulties despite having invented technology that enriched the world. It wasn't until the 1990s that her contributions were rediscovered, and she began receiving belated recognition. She was awarded the EIAA Pioneer Award in 1997, 20 years before her death. But by then, she'd spent most of her life in obscurity, her brilliance buried under the weight of being marketed as a body rather than a mind. Davis's comment, dismissing Lamarr's intellectual pursuits as a whore's distraction, represents the systematic erasure of women's genius in an industry built on reducing women to their sexuality. Veronica Lake, the prop that broke. Bette Davis called Veronica Lake a prop for men's fantasies. And Davis was right, but not in the way she meant. Lake's story is perhaps the most tragic precisely because she refused, at critical moments, to play the game that the system demanded, and was destroyed for it. Veronica Lake was born Constance Frances Marie Ockelman in 1922 in Brooklyn. She was shy, intelligent, and ambitious. She wanted to act, but she had no connections, no family money, and no obvious pathway into the industry. She was also beautiful in a particular way, pale, ethereal, with distinctive platinum blonde hair that fell across one eye in what became her signature peekaboo hairstyle. Studios discovered Lake and marketed her aggressively based on her appearance. The peekaboo hair became her brand. It was iconic. It was also reductive. Lake was a capable actress with genuine range, but she was positioned as a visual commodity, a walking, talking hair advertisement. Her value to the studios was entirely contingent on her maintaining the specific appearance that had been manufactured for her. Any deviation, cutting her hair, gaining weight, aging, would destroy her marketability. During the early 1940s, Lake achieved stardom. She appeared in films like Sullivan's Travels and The Glass Key, demonstrating real acting ability, but she was constantly pressured to be available for publicity events, photo shoots, and personal appearances, where she was essentially displayed as an object. The line between her professional obligations and sexual availability became increasingly blurred. Producer Buddy DeSilva became interested in Lake. DeSilva had significant power within the industry and expected sexual compliance from actresses under contract to him. When Lake refused his advances, he didn't accept the rejection. Instead, he systematically destroyed her career. He blacklisted her within the industry, made certain she received no desirable roles, and spread damaging rumors about her. Lake's career went into freefall almost overnight. By the late 1940s, Lake was unemployable in Hollywood. She was in her late 20s, but her career was finished. The studio system had used her, and when she'd refused to be used further, it had discarded her. Lake spent her final decades working as a cocktail waitress, a nightclub performer, and eventually in small television roles. She struggled with alcoholism, battled financial insecurity, and dealt with the psychological trauma of having been built up and destroyed by an industry that saw her as disposable. In interviews, Lake described the experience of being objectified. "I was a thing, not a person. The studios didn't want Veronica Lake the actress. They wanted the hair. They wanted the image. When I tried to assert myself as a human being with agency and boundaries, I was punished." Davis mocked these statements as self-pity from a has-been, but Lake's analysis was accurate. She had been treated as a prop. When she refused to be a compliant prop, she was destroyed. Lake died in 1973 at age 50, largely forgotten except as a nostalgic reference to a 1940s hair trend. Her actual artistry was secondary to her image. Her agency was never respected. Her boundaries were violated and then weaponized against her when she tried to enforce them. She became a cautionary tale, not because she'd been promiscuous or ambitious, but because she'd had the audacity to refuse. Bette Davis wasn't wrong about Hollywood's corruption. She was just selective about which truths she acknowledged and whom she blamed. Yes, some actresses traded sex for roles, but they did so because men with institutional power demanded it as the price of entry. They were surviving a system architected by predators. Davis, who used her own strategies to climb, condemned theirs, not as an act of moral clarity, but as a way to secure her own legend by weaponizing other women's trauma. By the end, 7 actresses were remembered as scandalous or forgotten. One was remembered as a legend. The system didn't change. It perfected itself, turning a woman's willingness to destroy other women into a definition of strength.